Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video I wanted to discuss this somewhat bizarre transformation in our understanding of what space is like. Something that was actually just as significant as realizing that Earth was not the center of the universe, and that Earth was just one of many planets inside one of many star systems. Yet this particular realization is actually something that many of us have noticed when we were younger, but at least in my case, it completely went over our heads, with most of us basically completely ignoring this until someone actually points it out. Alright, I'm gonna stop creating so much suspense, making this mysterious and stuff, and basically tell you exactly what we're discussing. When exactly did humans realize that space is dark? And though this might sound like a silly question, for those of you who are much older, think of all of those cartoons and all of those movies you used to watch where space was portrayed in an entirely different way. And I actually spent the last hour trying to find as much media as I could that literally shows you what pretty much everyone on Earth believed back then. For example, there's a link in the description that takes you to the first season of Colonel Bleep. This is a cartoon from 1957 that explores some of these ideas of space travel through a somewhat childish perspective. Or here's something a little bit more famous. This is Disney, and specifically a documentary that showed space travel as we imagined it back then in a film called Mars and Beyond. Both of these were produced back in 1957. But here's actually something even more famous, and something that even I was watching when I was much younger. Duck Dodgers in the 24th century. I think this is probably one of the most iconic space travel cartoons, and is a cartoon I personally rewatched many times when I was like 6 or 7. But notice one thing. The space in this case is actually portrayed somewhat differently. As a matter of fact, here's another picture from the movie The Phantom Planet, where it's also shown to us as basically blue. And well, that's because for most of human history, and specifically in the Western world, the universe outside of planet Earth was not imagined as dark black vacuum. And instead, pretty much most people perceived it as this realm of eternal light that was maybe just a little bit darker than the sky. And so for centuries and possibly thousands of years, people believed the daytime sky was space, and because it was blue, space was also believed to be blue. And so people assumed that if you could fly high enough, you would not see a black void, but instead a kind of a blue universe, sometimes referred to as the azure heavens. And when I actually read about this, my mind was completely blown because I remember watching a lot of media back in the days, and I remember wondering why exactly was the space shown so blue, even though in the 80s when I was a child, we knew it was black. And a lot of this is actually explored in the studies by Vladimir Bryljuk, whose name I totally mispronounced, so my apologies. But anyway, this wonderful person has actually been posting quite a lot of fascinating studies on the idea of space age from the perspective of different types of media, but mostly focusing on literature. And he actually even goes as far as to argue that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space, and there were people before him that saw it and commented on this eternal darkness. Now, personally, I'm not going to go this far because for me Gagarin is still basically the first man in space, but we're still going to be discussing this incredible idea in regards to how our perception of space changed so much. Okay, so let's discuss this older model first, and then try to figure out how all of this changed. And so in this older model, the bright blue sky was actually believed to be a kind of a firmament, or an actual ceiling of the cosmos, with the nighttime basically just being a temporary optical effect resulting from a shadow cast by planet Earth as the sun moved behind it. And so back in the ancient Greece, Aristotle and a lot of his contemporaries described night as nothing more than the shadow of Earth. And this is what even Copernicus believed centuries later. And so even Copernicus believed that if you were to somehow ascend the heavens during nighttime, you would eventually break out of this Earth shadow and emerge into a kind of a universal blue light that the entire universe was covered with. And the thing is, this bright space belief was so deeply ingrained in the human psyche that it actually survived long after the scientific revolution. So here even scientists like Albert Einstein and Edwin Hubble believed the same. But surprisingly, it was slightly different for the Eastern scientists, and specifically Arab scholars actually correctly identified that the sky's blue color was just an atmospheric effect, And they managed to figure this out back in the 9th century. The only reason this particular knowledge did not actually pass on to us, though, is because those scholars and a lot of their books and a lot of their knowledge was eventually lost when the Mongolian invasion basically razed entire cities. But eventually, even in the West, some scientists started to shift their opinions, and in the 17th century, scientists like Otto von Guericke, the German scientist who played a critical role in the scientific revolution, conducted groundbreaking experiments with vacuum that helped him realize that pure space was basically empty. And so back in 1650, he was able to invent the first ever air pump. And so in the West, he was the first to reason that if there was no particles for sunlight to hit in outer space, there should be no brightness and no blue light anywhere. And so he actually concluded that an observer in space would see nothing but shadows unless they looked directly at the sun. But despite being the first to announce this did not pick up until centuries later. And even as scientists began to understand the blackness of space, in the popular media and even in scientific media, a lot of this lagged behind. As a matter of fact, even in the 1880s and early 1900s, a lot of distinguished scholars still described cosmos as enormous sphere of blue. And this is actually what one of these recent studies talks about, because in a lot of media by John Milton and C.S. Lewis, the sky is not presented as dark, but as the heavens of blue that stretches everywhere. And so it wasn't really until the mid-20th century, and specifically the space age, that the reality of dark universe suddenly came into existence, and the enormous sphere of blue finally disappeared. And so that's actually why a lot of the cartoons from the 1950s seem to feature blue space, but by 1960s and 1970s, most media, including Star Trek, seem to show us the universe that's basically black. But the next question we have to tackle is, how exactly did this transformation happen? Because honestly, for the most part, I think most of us are actually not even aware this was a thing. And well, at first I did assume that maybe it was because of Yuri Gagarin, who did describe space as the place of profound silence and darkness. And so his description was definitely fundamental to solidifying this idea. But he was not the first. In other words, he was not the first to see space and to describe it for what it really was. That's because here we do have a group of pre-astronauts going back at least 2 decades, all the way to 1935. And specifically, we do have so-called balloon explorers. These were pioneers using high-altitude balloons, with some of the first flights in the 1930s all the way to 1950s. And in this case, they managed to reach the stratosphere, which allowed them to experience conditions similar to space. And so officially they did not reach space, but they were over 20 kilometers in altitude, where you do get to see space for what it is. And here are the first explorers. In 1935, Explorer 2 balloon reached 22 kilometers, with the pilots Albert Stevens and Orville Anderson that flew in a pressurized gondola, for the first time in history witnessing the curvature of Earth, and the sky darkening to very deep blue and becoming almost black. So not super black, which is what you'd expect from true space, but they were definitely the first to see that it was not blue. And so it actually took 2 more decades until Malcolm Ross and Lee Lewis to finally see total blackness. This was in Stratolab 1 in 1956. And here we had the first humans to officially record seeing complete darkness, which essentially allowed them to see actual space. And after this, several more balloonists described the same, with David Simmons in 1957, Joseph Kittinger in 1959, and most importantly, this person, Ivan Kinkelo, who was able to see this in a rocket plane referred to as X-2. So essentially here we even had the first ever airplane pilot. And here he was even asked what the sky looked like, which he described as definitely black, inky color. And this is of course when a lot of scientists and a lot of people in general started to realize that the familiar blue world was only visible on Earth, not beyond it, which was eventually explained as a very specific atmospheric effect involving refraction of light. And so by 1961, Gagarin provided the first human confirmation that the entire space is black, and it was only the light surface of Earth that created a kind of a blue halo around it. which he also described during his first flight. And back then, this must have been a huge psychological shock, because a lot of science fiction fantasies of space travel always involved this colorful universe, which in reality was not real. And instead, space was suddenly seen as very hostile and resembled this super scary dark void. But there was one event that basically solidified all of this once and for all, and this happened in 1968. This was the Earthrise photograph taken by William Anders on the Apollo 8. And so here, seeing a fragile blue Earth in the middle of this pitch-black abyss fundamentally changed everyone's perspective once and for all. Here, it made Earth seem like just a tiny little ball, a luminous blue ball, inside this dark cosmic desert. And interestingly, just a few weeks ago, we've actually received this picture once again, but this time from the Artemis 2 mission. And though here the quality of this image is much higher than before, at least as of now, it did not seem to have the same psychological effect. As a matter of fact, unfortunately, most people I know, and probably most people you know, have not even seen this picture at all. And so, show it to them, because it's pretty cool. But I guess another question is, so why is this important, and what does all of this show us? Well, first of all, this shows us that the facts about the universe are very often filtered through our cultural imagination. And for many centuries, one of the unknowns in this case was obviously Earth's atmosphere. Because scientists did not understand how light scatters from the air, we had no idea the universe would be black. And so naturally this led to major misinterpretation of the nature of the universe itself. And though today we do take this blackness for granted, by understanding that this is a relatively recent discovery, it does help us kind of appreciate the overall fragility of our own scientific knowledge. And so the transition from a universe of eternal light to the one of eternal darkness wasn't just some kind of a scientific update, it was a profound shift in how we feel about our own place in the cosmos, with images like this essentially solidifying this perspective. And so here we went from living in a world that was a small part of a very bright divine heaven to living on this very fragile, small protected island in the vast, dark universe of complete blackness. But chances are that in the next few decades, we'll have some other profound transformations in regards to the universe, because there are still so many things for us to discover pretty much everywhere, both on our planet and of course beyond it. And once we discover something really cool, we'll definitely discuss this in one of the future videos. Until then, check out the links in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.